Okay, well, thank you, Professor Sean, for inviting me to come and talk about the Bible and Western literature. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. All right, so let's have a look at what is the Bible. So for those of you who are not that familiar, then the Bible is separated into what's called the Old and New Testament. The Old Testament is basically the Jewish Bible, whereas the New Testament, you could say, is the part that Christians believe. The Old Testament, it includes Jewish history. A lot of it is history of the Jewish nation, how they started from Abraham, who gave birth to Isaac, then Jacob, who then gave birth to what's called the 12 patriarchs, had 12 sons, who then became 12 tribes of Israel. And then the history of Israel, how it became a nation, etc. It also includes laws, the laws of the nation that were given to Moses on Mount Sinai. It includes the prophets, that is basically God sending messengers to tell the Israelites off for being bad. And wisdom literature. We'll look at this in a bit more detail. The New Testament is including the life, teachings, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ, and also an account of the early church and various letters that were written to the churches. The Bible was written over 1,500 years, from 3,500 years ago until about 2,000 years ago. So over a very long period of time, and different authors from different cultures, written in 3 different languages, in Hebrew, in Aramaic, and also in Greek. The Bible has been translated into more than 3,000 different languages. It's the most translated book in the world by far, and is considered to be the ultimate authority on faith and practice for Christians. For those who are not Christians, it's of interest for its literature, for its history, for its philosophy, for its morals, its ethics as well. So different types of literature in the Bible. So firstly, historical. So it talks about how the earth was created. Actually, what's unique about the Bible is that several thousand years ago, everyone thought that the earth did not have a beginning, that the universe had always been. So it's only the Bible that talks about the earth or the universe coming from nothing. And in the 20th century, with the Big Bang Theory, then scientists proved that yes, actually, in fact, the universe did actually have an origin, which is in fact what the Bible had already said about 3,500 years ago. It talks about Exodus, how the Israelites went from being slaves in Egypt to becoming a free nation. It talks about various kings and the battles that they had. The Bible also has laws. Laws which are guidelines for justice and for the behavior of the people of Israel. It has many poems. The poems express praise and worship. They also express joy and lament as well. Wisdom literature. Wisdom literature, kind of similar to the Analects of Confucius, provide insights into life and morality. And there's prophecy. Prophecy, mostly future events that will happen, and also God's word for the people who are listening as well. Then there are parables. Jesus, he liked to talk in parables, which are stories with a spiritual meaning. So there's a surface level, which seems to be just about the father who had 2 sons. One son is rebellious, and he goes and wastes his father's wealth, and then he becomes bankrupt, and then he comes back to his father. So it's just a nice story of how a rebellious son becomes reconciled with his dad. But there's a spiritual meaning to it, which is talking about how all humanity have rebelled against God, and eventually, many then come back and are reconciled with God and discover that God actually, loves them more than anyone else. So, parables, stories with spiritual meaning. Then there are the letters, which are written to various churches. And then there's what's called the apocalyptic literature, which is visions of the end times and final judgment. So much of what will happen in the future. Bible's influence on Western culture. Why would it be worthwhile for someone who does not believe in Christianity to read the Bible? Well, first, because it's a key to understanding Western culture. There's much within Western culture which has been influenced by the Bible. Western ethics has very much been impacted by the Bible. For example, Jesus taught that you should do to others as you would have them do unto you. So how would you like to be treated? Treat them the way in which you yourself would like to be treated. And that then has become what's called the Golden Rule. It's kind of similar to what Confucius taught, but it's a little bit different. And it's very much considering, what's good for other people. What's good for me is also good for other people. And so we seek to, be helping others because we ourselves would like to be helped. There's what's called the, Good Samaritan, in which you help someone who is in need, who you don't have any relationship with. That's a story that Jesus told, and that's also an ethic within Western culture as well. In art, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, many of their greatest paintings depicted scenes from the Bible. The greatest music, Bach and Handel, they composed many of their pieces based on the Bible. Then the law, the Ten Commandments has shaped Western law, especially when it comes to the dignity of the individual human being. And so, why is it that someone who is poor, why is that someone who is handicapped, someone who is considered to be inferior, then still has dignity? So that's very much shaped by the Ten Commandments, shaped by the law in the Bible. Then education. Yishou University. Why is there such a thing as a university? Well, universities globally now have been shaped by the first universities, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Princeton, which were all Bible colleges to begin with. So, you probably didn't know this, but the first universities, you went there in order to study the Bible. Nowadays, you go to university and you study everything except the Bible. But we still need the original Bible colleges to thank for the universities that we have today. Social movements, for example, the abolition of slavery. Throughout most of human history, most empires have had slaves. But then in the 19th century, slavery was abolished. Why? Because those who were campaigning for the abolishment of slavery were basing their campaign on the Bible as well, because they believed in what I mentioned, human dignity. And of course, there's the calendar events like Christmas and Easter. Christmas celebrates the birth of Jesus Christ, and Easter celebrates the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Two big events in the Western calendar, and certainly Christmas has become worldwide. Then there are common cultural references as well. So even today, people would talk about David versus Goliath. It was a David versus Goliath match. And what's that referring to? Well, they are talking about when the underdog beats the stronger power. When someone who is much bigger gets defeated by someone who is much smaller. David Goliath events in the Bible. Then the Good Samaritan, I also mentioned just now, symbolizing kindness to strangers. So people talk about, that person was a Good Samaritan. What they mean is that they were helping someone who They just happened to meet on the streets. Prodigal son. That is also a term that is being used. Symbolizes a return after wasting your life. I used to be a prodigal son, but then I quit smoking, I quit drinking, I quit drugs, and I came clean and came back to my father. Or Armageddon. People talk about Armageddon, describing a catastrophic final battle as well. It's very much used in literature and in movies. All right, literature shaped by biblical narrative. There are several books which are very much based upon the story of the Bible. So one is Paradise Lost by John Milton. So the story of Paradise Lost goes like this. Firstly, it talks about Satan rebelling against God. Originally, Satan is in heaven and has a lot of power and authority, but he decides that he'll rebel. And he and the other angels who rebel with him then are cast into hell. In hell, they vow to revenge. They want to get back at God. And so how do they do that? Well, Satan then travels to earth. He goes to earth in order to corrupt human beings. And so here you see, Satan falling from heaven, or maybe he's going down to earth. And Satan then disguises as a serpent and enters into the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve are living there in sort of perfect joy. And he tempts Eve to eat the forbidden fruit. And then Eve takes a bite from the forbidden fruit and gives it to her husband Adam. After eating it, they both feel great shame and guilt. They feel that we have really done something that is wrong. And they notice that they are naked and they feel shameful about it. So then God sends the archangel Michael to the Garden of Eden. And Michael then announces to Adam and Eve the command from God that they've been expelled from the garden. And Michael then shows Adam visions of humanity's future. Shows what's going to happen to your sons, to your grandsons. The story then ends with hope for mankind. And so I think for many of you, you might have read or know of the story of the Garden of Eden. I think was it the last class or so, we should talk about it. But Paradise Lost by John Milton is basically based upon that story. So much of it is the same. But it's a very long poem, which is worth reading. And it kind of goes into much more detail than the story in the Bible. Then there's the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis, he taught at both Oxford and Cambridge, considered to be one of the greatest literary writers of the 20th century. So he wrote this story for children, and it talks about 4 children called Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. So it's during the Second World War, and they are sent to the countryside in order to be safe from the attacks of the Germans. And in this large countryside manor, then the youngest sibling, who's called Lucy, she finds a wardrobe. And the back of the wardrobe opens up into a new kingdom called Narnia. And in this kingdom, then Lucy befriends a fawn called Mr. Thomas, and they become friends. But then Edmund, her brother, then also ends up in Narnia and meets the White Witch. And there he is tempted by the witch. There you go. There's the White Witch together with Edmund. This is being made into a movie series. So it came out probably about 10, 15 years ago. So you could watch it if you're interested. And then later on, all the siblings enter into Narnia. And then they hear this prophecy that because the White Witch is ruling over Narnia and making it so that it's always winter. So there's never any spring, never any summer. and it's always cold. And the whole place is just desolate and people are miserable. But then they hear about this prophecy that there's going to be an end to the White Witch's rule. They also hear about Aslan, who is a lion, who is the rightful king of Narnia. And Aslan is about to return. And as Aslan comes back, the winter starts to mount, or the snow starts to mount, and the winter starts to go away. But then Edmund, who had met the White Witch before, he betrays everyone and then goes to the White Witch. But then he's captured and taken by the White Witch, and he's imprisoned. At this point, then Aslan then sacrifices himself for Edmund. Otherwise, Edmund will be killed. So Aslan then is willing to be killed himself instead of Edmund. But then, after Aslan's killed, he comes back to life again. And then there's this big battle between Aslan and the White Witch's forces, at which, Aslan wins. Okay, so, and then the children are crowned as rulers of Narnia. They rule Narnia for many, many years. But then one day, then they manage to return through the wardrobe back to, England, and then they are back to who they were before as kids. All right, so this story by C.S. Lewis, you can hear echoes of the story of the Bible, Aslan being Jesus, and how Aslan sacrifices himself, same as Jesus sacrificing himself, in order that people can be saved. So those two stories very much based upon the Bible, but in fact there are many stories throughout Western literature that have biblical themes to it. So let's have a look at a few of them. All right, firstly, one of the central themes in the Bible is the fall, or the fall of humankind. In the Bible, then, we talked about this, you already are familiar. Adam and Eve's disobedience in Genesis 3, introduces sin into the world. So that's the Bible story. But then you also see the same theme in parts of literature as well. For example, there's this story called The Lord of the Flies. I had to read this when I was in secondary school. I didn't really understand it very much then, when I was about 13, 14 years old. But I think I kind of understand it better now. So in this story, Lord of the Flies, a group of British boys are stranded on a deserted island after a plane crash. At first, they try to create order by setting rules and electing a leader. However, without guides, to direct them, then the boys slowly lose control. And their initial attempts to cooperate and live peacefully fall apart as fear and rivalry take over. Some of the boys, they give in to their primal instincts, leading to violence and chaos. The story symbolizes the fall from innocence, showing how without moral boundaries or societal rules, humans can descend into savagery. This echoes the biblical story of Adam and Eve, where disobedience leads to the loss of paradise and moral corruption. So I didn't really understand the story then, but then rereading it, realized that, yes, very much talking about how originally these boys were friends. They tried to get along with one another and protect one another, but eventually things fall apart. They start to fighting with one another and even killing each other. Second temptation, a key theme in the Bible. Again, Eve's temptation by a serpent in Genesis 3. Showing how we are easily tempted to do evil. In literature, then Macbeth by William Shakespeare is a classic example. Macbeth, the main character in the story, is a brave and loyal soldier at the start of the play. However, when three witches tell him a prophecy that he'll one day become king, he becomes consumed by ambition. And encouraged by his wife, Lady Macbeth, he murders King Duncan to take the throne. After the murder, Macbeth spirals into guilt and paranoia. He commits more crimes to protect his power. His initial temptation to seize the throne at all costs leads to his eventual downfall. We can see how this story mirrors the biblical story of Adam and Eve, where temptation of power and knowledge then leads to sin and disaster. And in both cases, the consequences of giving in to temptation are devastating. A third theme in the Bible is justice. And you see in Genesis 4 how with Cain and Abel, who are brothers, Cain becomes jealous of Abel and kills him, but then that causes him to be punished by God. And in literature, then Crime and Punishment, which is a well-known Russian literary work, it follows the story of Raskolnikov, a young man who murders an old pawnbroker, believing that crime is justified because he plans to use the stolen money to help others. However, after committing the murder, Raskolnikov is consumed by guilt. He becomes physically and emotionally tormented, unable to escape the inner conflict caused by his actions. His guilt and suffering represent the idea of divine justice, that wrongdoing will ultimately lead to punishment, even if it comes from within. And so throughout the novel, then Raskolnikov, he struggles with the idea of whether he can be redeemed. In the end, he confesses to the crime and begins his path towards repentance, showing that justice involves not only punishment, but also the possibility of redemption. This reflects the biblical theme that true justice will be paired with forgiveness and opportunity for change. A fourth theme in the Bible is suffering and hope, or hope in suffering. And we see how, in Exodus, then Moses is the one who leads the Israelites out of Egypt, where they have been slaves for almost 400 years. And it shows how even in the deepest of suffering, that slaves, they still have this hope of a better future, and eventually they find that hope. And in literature, then, The Grapes of Wrath, it tells the story of the Joad family, who are forced off their farm in Oklahoma during the Great Depression. They head to California, hoping to find work and build a better life. Along the way, they face incredible hardships, whether it's hunger, death, betrayal, or exploitation. But despite everything, the Joads hold on to the hope that California will be their promised land. The novel mirrors the biblical Exodus, where the Israelites endure suffering in the desert while searching for their own promised land. Joe's story shows that even in the midst of great suffering, hope can keep people moving forward. The novel explores how suffering can test faith, but also strengthen the bonds of family and community. The fifth theme in the Bible is that of faith and doubt. How both are often present in a single person. In the Bible, we see this in Job's sufferings. When Job, he first loses his family, he loses all his sons and daughters, he loses all his property, and he himself becomes sick. And how he feels that it's so unfair that God will punish him in this way. In literature, then the brothers Karamazov, then they follow the lives of three brothers, each grappling with questions of faith, morality, and the meaning of life. Ivan, the intellectual brother, he struggles deeply with the existence of God, especially when he sees so much suffering and evil in the world. He cannot reconcile how good God would allow innocent children to suffer. So this philosophical struggle leads him to reject his faith. But then in contrast, his brother Alasher, who is deeply spiritual, holds on to his faith, even in the face of suffering. The opposing views create a powerful tension through the novel. The conflict between faith and doubt mirrors the biblical story of Job, who questions God's justice during his suffering, but ultimately remains faithful. The novel raises the question, how do we believe in goodness and justice in a world filled with pain? The next theme is that of good versus evil. So in the Bible, then, already mentioned, David and Goliath. A story in which Goliath is this huge giant who is a Philistine, an enemy of the Israelites, and he challenges the Israelites. And David, he's just this young shepherd boy, but then he fights against Goliath, this giant, and he wins. So in literature, then Beowulf is an epic poem about a hero named Beowulf, who fights against terrifying creatures that threaten his people. The first great battle is against Grendel, a monster who terrorizes the kingdom, killing and eating its warriors. After defeating Grendel, then Beowulf faces even more dangerous foes, including a dragon who threatens to destroy everything he's fought for. Beowulf represents the ultimate force of good, courageous, honorable, and willing to sacrifice himself for others. Grendel and the dragon, on the other hand, symbolize pure evil, destruction, and chaos. The battles between Beowulf and these monsters reflect the timeless theme of good versus evil. A struggle found in many biblical stories, like David's battle with Goliath, or the ultimate cosmic struggle between God and Satan. The poem shows that good must always rise to confront and defeat evil, even when the odds seem overwhelming. And then there's the theme of fate and defiance of God's will. And in the Bible, we see Jonah, who's a prophet, who was called by God to warn the people of Nineveh that God is going to judge them. But Nineveh is the great enemy of the Israelites. And so Jonah doesn't want to go to save his enemies. So what does he do? He escapes. But what happens? He takes a ship, and then there's a huge storm. Eventually he gets thrown into the sea and is swallowed by a big fish and stays in the fish for 3 days. So eventually he's like, okay, God, you win, I lose. He repents, and then he listens to God. So that's the story in the Bible of Jonah. In literature, then Moby Dick, is a story that tells of Captain Ahab, a ship captain obsessed with hunting down Moby Dick, who is a massive white whale that had previously maimed him. Ahab's obsession with killing the whale then consumes him, and he ignores warnings from his crew and even strange omens about dangers of his mission. So despite these warnings, Ahab is determined to defy fate and get his revenge on the whale, believing that his own will overcome nature. This obsession leads to his destruction, as Moby Dick ultimately destroys the ship, killing Ahab and most of his crew. Ahab's refusal to accept the limits of his power and his defiance of fate mirrors the biblical story of Jonah, who tries to flee from God's command. So both stories show that defying divine authority or natural order leads to disastrous consequences, with Ahab's downfall serving as a warning against hubris and the belief that one can control fate. Then a theme of betrayal and guilt. So in the Bible, then Judas is one of Jesus' 12 disciples. And he decides that he will betray Jesus, for money. But after he does so, then he's consumed by guilt, and so he commits suicide. In literature, then Othello by William Shakespeare has Othello, who's the main character. He's a respected general, but is manipulated by his supposed friend, Iago. Iago is jealous of Othello's success and angry about being passed over for a promotion. And so he plants seeds of doubt in Othello's mind, convincing him that his wife, Desdemona, is unfaithful. Othello's trust in Iago and his growing jealousy lead him to murder Desdemona. in a fit of rage. After her death, Othello learns the truth, that Desdemona was innocent and Iago had deceived him. Overcome with guilt, Othello realizes that his jealousy and betrayal have destroyed the person he loved most. His story of betrayal and guilt is similar to the biblical story of Judas betraying Jesus, where a trusted follower betrays someone whom is innocent, leading to devastating consequences. Like Judas, Othello is overwhelmed with guilt after realizing the gravity of his actions, showing how betrayal can lead to deep personal destruction. And then ninthly, the theme of sacrifice and redemption. So in the Bible, the greatest story is the story of Jesus' death on the cross, which is the ultimate sacrifice for humanity's redemption. But in literature, then A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens takes place during the French Revolution and follows two men, Charles Darnay and Sidney Carton. So Darnay is a nobleman who is falsely accused of being a traitor to the French people. And Carton is a disillusioned lawyer who believes that he has wasted his life. When Darnay is sentenced to death by guillotine, Carton realizes that he can save him. Although they look alike, Carton knows that Darnay has a family and future ahead of him, while Carton sees his own life as meaningless. So, in an act of love and redemption, Carton sacrifices his life by secretly switching places with Darnay and going to the guillotine in his stead. This act of self-sacrifice not only saves Darnay, but also redeems Carton, giving his life meaning and purpose. So the theme of redemption through sacrifice then echoes throughout this story. Carton's ultimate act of love transforms from a wasted life into a hero, showing that redemption is possible, even in the darkest moments. So why do authors use these biblical allusions? Why do they base many of their stories on the stories of the Bible? Well, first, because the Bible is essentially world's cultural heritage. As I mentioned, it's been translated into over 3,000 different languages, every country in the world, and pretty much anyone who has studied Western literature is familiar with the Bible. And also because it connects past experiences to today. The Bible was written 2,000, 3,000 years ago, and yet the stories in the Bible are very much the same as the stories that happen to us even today. Also because it makes the story deeper. So you write a story and you make allusions to the Bible. So what happens is that people think at two different levels. They think about the story in which one man dies for another. But then they also relate it to the story of Jesus dying for all humanity. And so it gives two different levels to the story that you are writing. Also, it links everyday life with sacred ideas. So the Bible talks about sacred things. It talks about things that are pertaining to God, to heaven. And so when writers then link their story to Bible stories, it then brings a connection between what is of earth and what is above. Also because it has universal themes like love and justice. So you could say simply because the Bible has many good themes that they would like to draw upon. And why try to identify some of these themes? So I just gave 11 different pieces of Western literature that all contain biblical themes. Why spend that time looking for these themes? Well, first, to improve cultural literacy. And so that way then it improves your ability to read literature. So especially Western literature, if you can spot the biblical themes, that actually helps you to understand. Then also because finding allusions is like solving puzzles. So in a minute after the break, then I'll give you some pieces of literature, and then you can try and spot the theme from the Bible. It's just for fun. This is not going to be tested. And also because then you can identify hidden meanings in the stories. So oftentimes the writer will write it thinking about a story in the Bible. So it's up to you, the reader, whether or not you can actually find it. And also it helps you to think critically when reading as well. So after break, then we will have this spotting biblical reference in literature game.